If you would like to open up your Bible to Exodus 20, that's the chapter where you can find the Ten Commandments. And this has been our outline for this class to talk about the laws of Moses. It's not just the thing that is mentioned in this text, but the broader principles and values that we see from here. So, honor your father and mother. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 12. That is something that you see throughout the scripture. There's a lot of it. And the principles are honor your father and mother. Don't disrespect your father and mother. And then there's different ways that you see those laws reflected. But the value that underlies it is that the home and the family matters. And so then you can start to apply it better to your life. You shall not murder. So there's lots of different things about taking life and assault. Life matters is the value under that. And so we're going to value all life in every form. I asked Kevin last week to skip in verse 14, you have commandment number 7, which is you shall not commit adultery. I didn't want to stick that one on somebody else's plate. So Kevin did property rights. I listened to that class. It was really good last week. I thought, when I was listening to Kevin's class, I was writing notes, and I thought, this is way better than the class that I was going to do. So I'm glad that he taught that one. And then the idea is that there is such a concept as personal property and property rights. And Christians are not people who can just go around taking stuff that doesn't belong to you. And then today is verse 14. This is what we're going to look at in our class, and that is you shall not commit adultery. So before we get started, is there anything that you want to say about anything up to this point? Any comments about this class, the laws of Moses, your impression about the laws, anything at all up to this point in the class that you want to say before we get started? Now would be a good time to do that. Is it pretty much what you expected from the laws of Moses, or what's your general impressions? Does anybody have any impressions one way or another about any of these laws or principles or values? No? Did you have?
Many times we think about the law of Moses as it applies to the Old Testament, doesn't apply to us today. But when we see these principles of what the law of Moses are, they very much apply to us today.
Yeah.
God's intent of behind the law has not gone away.
Yeah. The eternal, that's one of the things that should be a major part of our conversation today. I'm going to try to focus us towards that. The eternal nature and character of God that underlies why he gave that law doesn't change. God's character is the same. And so that's the value. That's the thing that we want to understand. And you can see that marriage faithfulness is one of the things that I have up there as a value, but I think it is even deeper than that. I hope that we can understand more. Okay, so today, let's start with some of these passages about adultery, but I want to start with this. And it might seem silly to you to start in this way, but let's just start by saying, what is adultery? I'll give you just a second to roll it through your head, and maybe you don't have a complete dictionary-ready definition ready to come out of your mouth, but throw some elements out. What is it? What is adultery? Yeah, Ian.
Say me and somebody's married, and then I'm tired of that person, and I have something with somebody else other than my wife. I committed adultery already.
Yeah, you mentioned the key element in your definition. You mentioned marriage. It's good. Good definition. Yeah, Rob?
So I'm probably not as comfortable with the Hebrew words that are translated. In the New Testament, when we talk about adultery, we're usually talking about the Greek word moikai, which, as Ian indicated, it's sexual intercourse when somebody, one of the people involved is married to someone else. This is to be differentiated from what is sometimes translated as sexual immorality, which would be the word porneia, which sometimes is translated as fornication.
Right.
But, I mean, maybe you can help me. I'm getting a sense, based on the comments that you've already made, that this is more akin, what's being discussed here, definitely to moikai, when one of the people involved with the sexual immorality is married to someone else.
Yeah, that's right. That's the thing that I want us to make sure that we do here. Girl, see the dress. They're married. So I looked it up in several places, and this is kind of the reason why I wanted to talk about this. That if you go to Google and you type define adultery, and I did this in lots of different ways, because my Google definition, I saw it and I was like, I don't know about that. And then I did it I did it like in Chat GPT, I went to Webster and I looked at the definition. And one of the things that's interesting about this, Ian, the lines are what you described as something. Something between the husband and the wife, and something here, an extra woman. The thing about my definition online that I didn't like is that this is called adultery on the internet definition. The person who's married, who has sexual relations outside of the marriage, is an adulterer, and this is adultery. And you see right now, like, why I would say, like, when I saw that, I thought, wait a second, it gave me pause. I had to think about it for just a minute. And so I don't think, that's not the biblical definition of adultery. I think if you want to, like, who's the adulterer, this person is an adulterer, this person is an adulterer, and this thing happening between them is adultery. It's not just the person who's married. And you'll see that in just a second. But if you look at Matthew 5 and verses 31 and 32, that is about one of the best places that I think you can really... You'll see what we're talking about in the Leviticus 20 and the Deuteronomy 22 passages. But this one is really useful to paint this picture, to make this point. Matthew 5, 31 and 32, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries the divorced woman commits adultery. So in this scenario, it's the person involved in the marriage who is committing adultery, and the person who they're committing adultery with is adultery. And so I know that I'm not trying to like fuzzy it up or anything. I just want to make sure, don't Google this and rely on your Google definition, because I was actually a little surprised by that. So this is the way that I would think about this. And I don't know that this is the best definition. but it's a definition that works in my mind for adultery. You have sexual immorality Sexual immorality is your blanket term. It's your umbrella term. So there's lots of sexual immorality. That's actually a part of our sermon this morning. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 1, we'll look at the word sexual immorality or porneia. But if you do it like this, sexual immorality that involves two men is homosexuality. Sexual immorality that involves two women, homosexuality. Sexual immorality that includes animals, bestiality. There's different kinds of sexual immorality. Sexual immorality that includes a marriage is adultery. That's the best way, and I think that some of your definitions pulled that out too. But that's the best way for me to understand these. And I'm always really bad at this. I have to say it and process it. I can't do it. You know the thing where you say all this is that, but not this is that? So all sexually illicit relationships are sexual immorality, but not all are necessarily adultery. Right? You get what I'm saying with that? Adultery involves a marriage. That's the key to what we're talking about. And that's going to be really important for us getting to the values here real quick, because the command that God gives in Exodus 20 is not, you shall not commit sexual immorality, which is found in other places in the law. The specific command that God gives in the Ten Commandments is adultery, which involves a marriage. Specifically, a marriage is involved. I hear myself. I know that I've not been perfectly clear in that description. Do you have any questions or additions, or maybe you can improve upon that? This is my definition. Sexual immorality that involves a marriage. Anything you want to say about that? Yeah, Rob?
Well, no, I'm glad you make the distinction, and I feel like it's imperative that we all are very clear on this point that you're making, because when we hear the world talk about this, they very frequently don't get this definition right. In popular culture, popular books, you think about the Scarlet Letter, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote about Heather Prynne, who came down pregnant, had to wear a scarlet letter A. Well, there wasn't a marriage involved in that. They get this wrong, and somebody involved in fornication, they'll say, is an adulteress or an adulterer, and that's not right. Just what you said.
Yeah.
Marriage has to be involved.
Right. And that's going to be key for, so you're like, wow, Ryan, we just spent 17 minutes talking about that. That's going to be key for this conversation. There's a marriage involved that has to be understood.
I'm thinking about the principle behind it, but marriage is a covenant, is a contract, and God's people are also bound to Him in a contract, a covenant, a relationship with Him. Don't break that with your spouse. Don't commit adultery. Don't break that marital contract. He's going to expect the same thing out of His people with Him.
Okay, so we're jumping way ahead to the value section, but since you do, let's go ahead and start thinking about this right now. It seems like it's not necessary. Be patient with me when I say this. It seems like it's not necessarily the sexual immorality aspect that God is so mad about with this commandment. It's not okay. There's plenty of other places in the Bible that talk negatively about sexual immorality, and there's heavy consequences. But the fact that this one involves marriage, it seems that the part that he's really mad about is the violating of that covenant. the breaking the covenant, which is different from I'm going to gratify my sexual desires versus I'm going to break my covenant promises that I made to God and to another person. That seems to be the key factor on what I'm really zooming in on this. So I'm glad you did it now. Let's look at a couple of these real quick. I think this is a good part of the conversation to help with our definitions. Leviticus 20. If you will look in my Bible, I've got a heading above verse 10 that says punishments for sexual immorality. And verses 10 through 21 is just this giant list of different kinds of sexual immorality. There's all kinds of different stuff that a person can do that is sexually immoral. So you could have other words specifically. Sexual immorality with two men, homosexuality. Sexual immorality with an animal, bestiality. Sexual immorality with a marriage, adultery. Sexual immorality with family. What's the word for that? Incest. See what I'm talking about? There's specific words and a big general word. So there's incest listed in this chapter in verse 10. But verse 10, the very first one on the list is, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. There is another example that the Google definition is not correct. The man commits, switch the genders. If a man commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, adulterer, adulteress. It's not just, this is not the only thing that is adultery. This whole thing is adultery. But there's adultery, there's a marriage involved, and there is the consequence, which is both of them. Do you see that in verse 10? Both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. So, I don't necessarily want to I'm not asking this question because I want an answer, but I kind of do want to talk about it, even though the answer is pretty obvious, I think. But the death penalty for adultery and the death penalty for both people involved, what are we learning about the nature of a crime from God's perspective when he says the consequence is death for everybody involved? And I think that's like, it's the same consequence for murder. You commit adultery, death penalty. And that should immediately make us say, okay, no matter what my thinking is on the subject, if I calibrate my thinking to the Bible and to God's thinking, this is serious stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, I just want to drill in on your comment on those. You mentioned homosexuality, bestiality. You're saying that's not adultery. Those are different words. Is that what I'm hearing you say? The adultery has to be man, woman, woman, man outside marriage. Is that what you were saying?
I'm not sure how to answer your question. What I'm saying is, for sexual immorality to be adultery, there has to be a marriage involved somewhere.
Yeah, I'm just going back to your diagram. To really, is it a circle around a man and woman that's married, and anything outside that involves sexuality, regardless of person or beast, is adultery? Or, so that's one question. The second question is, what about idolatry? Because I know in the Bible it talks about idolatry, and when I taught Revelation and letters to the churches, there was references of idolatry, and some of the commentary referred to how that links sometimes to adultery. So I was curious if that has a fit here.
I'm not sure that I understand your question, but I have something in my head that I want to go through. So let me do that. And maybe you got to be patient with me. you might have to say it again, all right? Or probably what'll happen is when I turn around, Becky, this is what happened. Becky goes, what he's saying is, and that, but here's my problem. My problem is when I have something in my head, it's got to come, like, there's a block. Before I can do anything else, I'm thinking of something. So your comment made me think of this, which is a very real scenario for our world today. Maybe totally unrelated, but you made me think about it. What happens if in our world today you have a gay marriage, a man and a man, and they're married with a civil marriage, like they went to the courthouse, they filled out their papers, they had their ceremony, they're married, and outside of this marriage, I don't care, that could be a man or a woman, this guy has sexual immorality, sexual relationship with somebody outside of this marriage. Is that adultery? Why no? Because it's not a marriage in the first place, right? Because this is not a marriage. They went to the courthouse, but they're not married, right? So sexual immorality, how about this? Sexual immorality, homosexuality, sexual immorality, but not adultery because there's no marriage. And that's where you would do this thing too. What happens if there's a divorce that happens here because she burned the toast and he got mad about it, and so they're divorced, but he goes over here and gets married. This is the Matthew 5 and the Matthew 19 one that we looked at. Even though there's a divorce, even though you go to the courthouse and you file the papers, this is still a marriage, and so this is still adultery. And all to say this, adultery demands that there be a marriage involved. Okay, try again.
So your example got close, but I don't think it directly answered this first question. I was going to do that by changing your example just a little bit. So let's say we have, in your first diagram, married man, married woman, legitimate marriage. The man has a homosexual relationship with another man. That is both homosexuality and it's adultery.
Because a marriage is involved.
That answers his first question.
Good. I want to sing the song about, I get by with a little help from my friends. Yeah.
So I just want to clarify, not that, I can't even begin to touch that. So it's, when they're talking about the consequences of adultery here in Leviticus, it is physical death,
What is the first part of your question? What?
like the consequences, like if you do this,
Oh, yeah.
you die.
Oh, yeah.
So they mean physical death, not just spiritual.
Well, no, there's a Bible word for what you're talking about. And in this context also, it is sometimes the Old Testament law says, and they will be cut off.
Okay.
And that's like excommunicated from the community, cut off from God. No, this one is put to death. Yeah, that's a really good. And since we're there, let's do this. Deuteronomy, let's push forward just a little. Deuteronomy 22. It's the same thing. You can see verses 13 through 30 has the heading on there, laws concerning sexual immorality, and there's lots of different kinds of sexual immorality that take place, or that shouldn't, but can take place. But verse 22, if a man is found lying with a wife of another man, marriage, wife of another man, both of them shall die. There you go, Benny. Both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman, so you shall purge the evil from Israel. There is an evil thing that has happened here, and it has to be addressed. And purge the evil, the way that God says to do that in the Old Testament law is both get put to death. Okay, that's adultery. I'll move forward in a second. I want to move forward into values But first, here is adultery. Are we good on the law? Any questions, any comments, anything about adultery? Okay. So then this would be the question. I don't know how I wrote this next section up. Yeah. So the next question. Why is God so mad about adultery? Oh yeah, Riley, go ahead.
Not to backtrack, but in your first scenario, because it's a very real scenario, they get divorced, he remarries, and commits adultery there. Does she now have the biblical rights to remarry?
Yeah, you're describing a thing that's called the mental divorce position. Because, no, I don't want to talk about that right now. That's a rabbit trail. No. I'll draw pictures later. But no, the answer is no. Yeah. That fits more into divorce and remarriage rather than adultery. So, yeah. Okay, so the question with adultery, death penalty. That's the part that really makes me like, whoa, like, hey, the death penalty's involved here. So the question is, what are we learning about God, and why does God get so mad about adultery? And when I mean so mad about it, I mean he requires the death penalty and says you have to purge the evil from Israel. So what are we learning? What value are we learning about God here?
To distill it in a way that I understand it is life is in obedience to God's word. Death is in contrast to God's word.
That's true in the sense of Genesis 3. In the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. But in the Old Testament, not all sin constituted the death penalty. I mean, spiritually you're dead and separated from God, but this is... Go ahead.
I was going to say, marriage is in practice like the holiest thing that we do. We set ourselves apart for each other. And if we can't manage this in person, sitting beside each other and spending every day with each other, all day, every day, then how can we possibly have that covenant with God? And so even God uses marriage as a microcosm for his relationship with his people.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can't do this, then we can't serve God.
Yeah, yeah. So I have two things on the board. I'll throw them up there both right now. But the second one is where I talk about that, and I think that's a really good point. In 1 John, in our 1 John class, we read a passage a couple weeks ago that said, if you hate your brother who you can see, how can you love God who you can't see? And the idea is those relationships are figurative for our relationship with God. If you can't even do this one, how are you going to do this one? And that same concept is involved in honoring your father and mother. If you honor your father and mother, you learn what it looks like to honor God and the authority and all of that. And so that is this conversation only with faithfulness. Did I have Lisa and then Dustin?
I think if you back up from Exodus 20 and go into 19, and where he says, now, in verse 5, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And for the Lord, your question was, what do we learn about God? That's how much he loves us, and we're a special treasure. That's pretty special for the Lord to say that about us broken people. And so it's like that's the driver.
Yeah.
We're his treasure.
I think I think you can even go one step farther back. You're not wrong. That's perfect. That's a great comment. But one step farther backwards. And so let me get 3 volunteers here real quick. Reader number 1, who's it going to be? Okay, Brennan, Exodus 34, 6 and 7. Reader number 2, Benny, Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9. Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9. Number 3, Luke, Lamentations 3, 22 to 24. Lamentations 3, 22 to 24. Would you have still raised your hand if you knew it was going to be Lamentations? I should have said it first. Who wants to do? Got it. Yep. Okay, Brennan, I think. Exodus 34 and verse 6.
The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
Sure.
Keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation.
Yeah. God, I want to see you. I want to know you. I want to know who you are. And he says, I'm going to tell you who I am. Number 1, this is my name, Yahweh, the Lord, Yahweh, Yahweh. This is who I am. And I am abounding with steadfast love and faithfulness. That passage is key for the Bible and understanding God. Because there is no understanding God and his nature without understanding that he is faithful in his core. Faithfulness is not something that he does. Faithfulness is something that he is. It's a part of his nature. That's key to understanding who God is. Benny, Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9.
Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, a faithful God who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments to 1,000 generations.
Yeah. Every time he describes himself, I am a God who keeps my promises. I am faithful and I keep my steadfast love. It keeps on going and I keep my promises all the way to the generations and generations and generations. Okay, Lamentations 3, 22 to 24.
The Lord's loving kindness indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will have hope in him.
Great is your, that's a song. Great is thy faithful. We sing about it. It's his nature. God is a faithful God. And so this is the piece, yes, Lisa, yes, 100%. His bride is somebody that he loves and treasures. But not always. Like, sometimes they were terrible. And he said, I'm going to kill all of you in the wilderness. But always, I made a promise to you, and I'm going to keep my promise. The faithfulness is the key. I don't think there's any appreciating the adultery command and the consequence of death without first understanding that God is a faithful God, and to violate the marriage covenant is... I was thinking this when you made your comment about all, not you, when you made your comment about all, to be with God is life, to disobey God is death. To disobey God is to violate his nature and his character. And I stand before God and before all of you witnesses, and I say to my bride, I am making you this promise. I'm promising to you covenant. I'm promising to you, you're all here singing, and then I violate that promise by being unfaithful. That is a violation of the nature of God. That's adultery.
I think something else that this brings to mind of why, or like what the weight is due to the death penalty being associated with it, is God also values families highly. And if you can't keep to the agreement that you're going to be with this one person, how do you also keep, like, also take care of children if you're, if that base for the family is unstable?
Yeah.
And like, what does that do to the society where that's rampant?
Yeah.
We can't see it, but
So isn't that interesting that God said, when this happens, if this happens, purge it. Because there's, like,
There's implications.
right. And the key thing for us, this is what I really want us to grab. The key thing for us, this is still true. I'm not saying that sexual immorality is okay. You know that I'm not saying that, right? But what I want us to do is to see beyond the sexual immorality into what is really the core problem in this. And the core problem is my lack of faithfulness. That I am violating the nature of God by not doing what I said I was going to do. And that goes way beyond marriage, to be a faithful person. But this is a special covenant, and it's like, man, to your thing over and over again. If I can't, I'm going to stand before witnesses and make a covenant to God and make a covenant to you. If I can't do that, like, I am in big trouble. Dustin, I've seen you a couple times.
Yeah, so, tell me if I'm off base on this. Also thinking about, man and wife, they're joined together. It even says in Genesis that they become one flesh. So the adultery aspect of it is literally, we have a life for a life. You have one life put together, and now you have the adulterer and the adulteress are killing that life because they're breaking that covenant, which is why the death penalty is involved.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good image. It's good to put the image in my head. What you're
And so the other aspect of it is the whole purging thing. It took me straight to Romans 1, where it gives all this list of all the things that are evil in the sight of God. Sexual immorality is one of them. And it says, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice those things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those. So that's purge it from you. Purge it. Don't allow it to happen. Yes, you are going to have to kill it because you have to purge it from yourselves.
Yeah.
Because you're accepting it.
Yeah, and you can't, well, this time, no.
Look where we're at now.
Yeah, that's right. So here's what I want you to take from this class. Because this class is all about taking this law and learning something about it that's going to be true for my life. Like, what kind of a person, now that I know something about God, what kind of a person am I going to be because of it? And I hope that we've articulated this enough so that you are able to see beyond, I will be entirely faithful to you with zero exceptions. In this scenario, well, I made a mistake. Doesn't exist. No mistakes. Well, we all make mistakes. Not this one. Seriously. No mistakes. Death penalty teaches us that. No mistakes. But we're going beyond this to say, now that I know something about the character and the nature of God, I'm going to be a loyal person. I'm going to be a faithful person in general. I'm going to be a person who does what I say. I'm going to do the things that I say I'm going to do and not do the things that I'm not going to do. And all of that is rooted in this concept of faithfulness. God is a faithful God who does what he says, and we are to be made in his image, faithful people who do what we say, but especially in covenant relationships like marriage.
So you made this statement earlier, you revised the scripture for it, you were talking about how the covenant relationship between a man and a woman is sometimes symbolic of the covenant relationship between us and God. And it says that, right? It says that in Ephesians 5 and verses 22, 23, right down around there, when Paul has just got done discussing a man loving his wife and a wife being respectful to her husband, all those things having to do with marriage, he says, now this is a mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. And so there's scripture for that, for what you're saying. That's exactly right. And I think this gets back to something Mark said too about your initial question of why does this make God so mad? Well, it makes him mad because this is symbolic of our relationship with him, and it's breaking a covenant that we stood right there before God and everybody and said, I'm making this promise to you in front of God and everybody. It has to do with, we're talking about why something makes God mad, so I should that's symbolic of our covenant to God, and we're doing it haphazardly and without much thought, and it just shows how committed we are.
Yeah.
Or how committed we aren't.
Or how committed we are capable of being.
Yes.
So we're done. The class is over. This is for next time. Verse 16, our next one is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. I want you to think about something to get rid of that class. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor is not just telling lies. This is a specific, court environment, court scene. And so I'm sitting in the witness stand, and somebody says, the prosecutor says to me, did you see Becky steal that thing? And I didn't. She didn't steal the thing, but she's my mortal enemy, and I want her to get in trouble, so I said, yes. I have just bore false witness against my neighbor in that sense. And what I want us to do in the next class is I want us to dive deep into the meaning of bear false witness. This is what you think about between now and next Sunday. Don't violate justice. Justice is right, righteousness. Do the right thing, to be right before God. And if you expand the concept to don't violate justice, that's going to move us through 3/4 of the prophets and what the prophets were talking about. So what does it mean and what does it look like to not violate justice? That's our class next Sunday morning. Okay, thanks for the conversation this morning.